Hello, Philosophy 102. So this week we're going to focus on cognitive biases. Last week, as you'll remember, we talked about what an argument was and was not. This week we're going to talk about what can affect our judgment of arguments. So cognitive biases are pretty well known. If you've taken a psychology class, chances are you have encountered some cognitive biases or you've discussed them. They're just unconscious features of psychology that can affect our mental processes and affect our judgment and evaluation of things. So there are a couple hundred of these, and they're usually pretty well researched or documented. We're only going to focus on a handful of them, specifically the ones that really mess up our rational conclusions and considerations. So first, we're going to talk about probably the most relevant one, at least for philosophy or critical thinking. So an example of a cognitive bias is that we tend to evaluate an argument based on whether we agree with it rather than on the criteria of logic, right? So let's talk about this argument. All pit bulls are dogs. Some dogs bite. Therefore, some pit bulls bite. I'm going to put this in our notes so we can just talk about it clean. All right, so a habit I like to get everyone into is to number your premises. It makes it a bit easier to see. And then I'm just going to put a C for conclusion. Sometimes the textbook is going to use this little triangle of dots. We'll talk about that when we get to it, but the C represents conclusion. So our first premise is all pit bulls are dogs. Our second premise is some dogs bite, and the conclusion that the textbook would like us to reason to is therefore some pit bulls bite. I usually initially get some pushback from students because, well, they've heard arguments about pit bulls, and not all pit bulls bite, or pit bulls are given an unfair reputation for being biters, etc., etc. Already, your background information is causing you to approach this argument a little sideways. Let's just take the argument as it is and see if this is a conclusion we can reliably reason to. Let's see if this is good reasoning. If we know that all pit bulls are dogs, which we do know, and we know that some dogs bite, which we do know, it's a fact of life, can we reliably come to this conclusion that therefore some pit bulls bite? Take a moment with this. You can write it down if you want to. Marry yourself with a yes or a no. Is this a good argument or not? What do we think of it? Okay. So textbook is going to tell us it isn't a good argument. And the textbook now says something that seems to confuse some people. You might as well conclude some pit bulls are fox terriers. After all pit bulls are dogs, and some dogs are fox terriers. So let's unpack that a little bit, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this premise right here, which bears a striking similarity to our first premise in the former argument we looked at, right? In fact, they're exactly identical. And then we're going to take our second premise, which is a little different. Some dogs are fox terriers. And that looks very similar to premise number 2, right? It's a statement about some of this earlier category, right? And then we're going to take their conclusion. You might as well conclude some pit bulls are fox terriers. And we're going to compare these side by side. And we can even put therefore in there. So some pit bulls are fox terriers. We can see that structurally these are nearly identical, right? We have all pit bulls are dogs for both of them. Okay, true fact. Our second argument, some dogs are fox terriers. That's true. Some dogs are indeed fox terriers, just like some dogs bite. That is absolutely true. But then we come to this conclusion, therefore some pit bulls are fox terriers. And we know that's not true. That's simply not true. But it is identical reasoning. When I say it's identical reasoning, this is what I actually mean. When we take out the nouns in here, right? Pit bulls, dogs, fox terriers, biting. Let's make this a bit more grammatical. Okay, so now we're describing actual categories of things, right? Things that bite. So they're more similar. And we'll talk about why I did that much later in the class. But we have all P R D, right? I've just taken the nouns out and replaced them by variables so we can get a look at the structure of this argument. Some D are, I'm just going to use B for things that bite, and it will also be for fox terriers, right? Some D are B, and then conclusion. Right? These are structurally identical. We can see that they're structurally identical. Using the exact same reasoning that might have made us, think that this was a good argument, we can get to this one, which is a bad argument. So why didn't we see that they were actually identical arguments? We'll talk about this more when we meet for formal class. So don't stress it if it's still difficult, but I want you guys to pause and really look at the structure of these things and see that this is not about the content of the argument so much as the structure. The reason we have this obviously lousy argument right here is so that we can see that this form of reasoning is going to be fallacious. Okay, let's move on. The textbook is a bit, ahead of us. If it took you a moment to see that the first argument is illogical, it's because its conclusion is something you know is true. The tendency to evaluate reasoning by the believability of its conclusion is known as belief bias. And this is really the first thing we're going to put in our notes. So, and a belief bias is just the tendency to evaluate reasoning by the believability of its conclusion. So let's get that in our notes. And now we have this nice clean definition. I capitalize this just to make it a little separate. Oh, that crazy font. Okay. So again, just to re-emphasize this, because it is a nuanced point, the reason we might have thought that this first argument was a good argument is that we know the conclusion is true. So, but what we're actually evaluating, or what we should actually be evaluating when we're evaluating arguments, is the structure of the thing, not the believability of the conclusion. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about some more cognitive biases. I love these. I don't know if you guys are as excited about them as me, but I'm quite excited. So there's a closely related cognitive bias. That's called confirmation bias. Maybe you've heard of it. This one is really popular. So usually if we're in class, I'd ask you guys to, if anyone wanted to define this for me, but because we are not, you can just excitedly email me and be like, I've heard of that, and it's super irritating. Okay. So confirmation bias refers to a tendency to attach more weight to evidence that supports our viewpoint. So this might seem like I'm going really slowly. I just want to make absolutely sure everyone keeps these two separate, right? The names of these things can get confusing because we are going to talk about several, and you will be tested on this. So we want to be keeping track of what these biases are. Right? So we've got belief bias, the tendency to evaluate reasoning by the believability of its conclusion, and confirmation bias, which is different. It's the tendency to attach more weight to evidence that supports our viewpoint. We're going to go back a little ways in the textbook because there's actually a really good example of this. So we've got this quote up here from Rush Limbaugh. Some of you guys might know who he is. He's a conservative AM radio host, arguably the most famous one. He was recently diagnosed with lung cancer and is back in the news again. But anyway, he's very political. Very, very political. And he essentially relays the news to people every day. So he's been quoted as acknowledging this. When a poll is really, really out of whack with what I want to happen, I do have a tendency to disregard it. So let's say there's a poll that said, we've got this election coming up, that Trump was going to lose horribly. Rush Limbaugh is a conservative radio host, so he wants Trump to win. He would just have a tendency to disregard that poll and say, well, that doesn't matter. Something's got to be wrong with it. It's not that important. We can find lots of different reasons to disregard things we don't particularly like. Maybe he would say, those of you who are familiar with conservative pundits will know what I'm talking about, but like, oh, that came from CNN. It's not a good poll. Right? You can challenge the source. There's lots of things you can challenge that enable you to disregard it. And he's just acknowledging and recognizing his own confirmation bias. This doesn't make him a bad guy. This is quite good. I hope we can all recognize that we have these biases because they're where our thinking goes wrong. So that bias that he's expressing there is confirmation bias, right? He's attaching more weight, or in this case, less weight, to evidence that disconfirms his viewpoint, or more weight to evidence that supports his viewpoint. Okay, I think that one's a lot of fun. Let's move on. So the textbook has this really great example. If you are a Democrat, you may view evidence that Fox News is biased as overwhelming. Right? If you're a Democrat, I'm sure you can think about this. Fox News, it's a conservative news channel. Obviously, they're biased. You just think this is an overwhelming, obvious fact. Conversely, if you're a Republican, you may regard the same evidence as weak and unconvincing. Right? That exact same set of evidence. We don't have disparate information here. We have the same information. We're all watching the same Fox News, assuming you're watching Fox News. It's not like some people get a different channel or something. It's just how we weight the evidence. And this can drastically affect our thinking. So, in science, good experiments are designed to ensure that experimenters can't cherry pick evidence. You may have heard of this referred to as cherry picking. So they're going to define this. That is, search for evidence that supports the hypothesis they think is true while ignoring evidence to the contrary. So that's just one form of, or one way cognitive or confirmation bias can really mess with our thinking. And, experimenters don't mean to do this. These are subtle cognitive biases. They happen without our even knowing. If you had a suspicion that somebody was stealing from you, for example, and they turned up with a similar shirt to one you had, or a shirt that you had and lost, and they could tell you where they bought it, and they had all this information. You might say, well, they're lying because I'm pretty sure they stole that. How should we weight that information that they've given us? Like, I have a receipt for it. I can tell you the shop it came from, right? If we've already made up our mind that this is the person who's stealing from us, and in fact stealing is going on, then we might disregard all the evidence they can give us. That's going to be confirmation bias, and we want to avoid that in our thinking. Okay, so the textbook elaborates on what I said earlier. There isn't any hard and fast difference between confirmation bias and belief bias. They're both unconscious expressions of the human tendency to think our side of an issue must be the correct side. And thinking critically means being especially critical of arguments that are supportive of our own points of view. This is super important, right? Just because we want to believe it's true doesn't mean it's true. We should be aware we're pretty subject to belief bias and confirmation bias. Unlike the textbook, I am going to ask you guys to be able to tell the difference between these two. So I'm going to skip this one because it's based on probability, and I don't think it really applies all that frequently. But let's talk about false consensus effect. So we're going to put this in our notes. Oh no, turn the bold off. Okay. I don't know where these fonts come from. It's so weird. Okay. So the false consensus effect refers to the inclination we may have to assume that our attitudes and those held by people around us are shared by society at large. So what does that mean? It might be immediately apparent to some of you. Why did that go bold again? So weird. Okay. So, we're all exposed to academia regularly, right? You guys are students and I'm a professor, and we all think that education is important. Obviously we do. We're all here participating in one way or another. Because everybody we see every day of our lives, well, not every day of our lives, especially not now that Corona has happened, but a lot of the people we interact with, right? These are the people around us. We all have this belief that higher education is incredibly important. Because those are the people we're most frequently exposed to, we can come to form the belief that everyone agrees, society at large, everyone agrees higher education is important. But if we think about that for a minute, we can recognize that that's not true. There are a lot of people who think learning a trade skill is more important, or being well-traveled is more important, and that higher education is just a means to an end, and maybe not even a very good one, right? We can recognize that not everybody shares that belief that we have, but it can be really tricky in so much as if everyone we're exposed to thinks that, or everyone we're exposed to agrees with us, we can start thinking that everyone actually does agree with us. So we want to be careful of this false consensus effect. It's called consensus because you achieve consensus when you have complete agreement. And obviously that's false. I'm trying to give you things to help you remember these. Okay. One more. I know this is pretty fast, but I assume you guys can pause if you need a moment to take down notes. We've got the bandwagon effect. That's not what I wanted. That's my recording software. Okay, so we've got the bandwagon effect. What is this guy? Some of you will know what a bandwagon is, and some of you will not. So a bandwagon is it's almost like an English idiom. It's something you get on board with. Everybody else is doing it, right? It's where the party is. It's where everyone's going. So the bandwagon effect refers to an unconscious tendency to align one's thinking with that of other people. Let's get this in our notes. Sorry about this. I don't know why it copy and pastes like that. It's keeping the PDF formatting. So an unconscious tendency to align one's thinking with that of other people. Again, these are very similar, but they operate in different directions, right? So in the false consensus effect, those are attitudes we already have and the people around us already have, and we're incorrectly assuming that everybody has those attitudes. Whereas the bandwagon effect, you don't already have this position, right? You're aligning your thinking with that of other people. So, for example, in Nevada, cannabis has been legalized for quite some time now. But there was a time when that was not okay. Most people thought that wasn't okay. And presumably that view was something they came to through their own reasoning. But this happens with lots of things. Once something is popularized, you let go of your own thinking, and not through any good reasoning or anything. You just get on board with what everybody else is doing. It looks like fun. I don't know. And I don't mean that to say that, adjusting your views is not a good thing, but we don't want it just to be because that's what everyone else is thinking. We want it to be for good reasons. So if you come to hold a different position about the legalization of cannabis or the recreational use of cannabis because you've actually read the research, or maybe you think it would be a good source of funding for school, or you come by this for good reasons, then that's great. By all means, adjust your viewpoint, but don't just get on board with it because other people are doing it. I don't need to stress the importance of this during an election cycle. So let's examine exactly how this operates. Bandwagon effect is a potentially powerful source of cognitive distortion. In famous experiments, psychologist Solomon Asch, maybe I said that incorrectly, found that what other people say they see, right? One person says, "Hey, I see a monkey," right? May actually alter what we think we see. And again, if this interests you and you want to know more about it, you can click on these little things and it'll take you to the source. So I wonder actually if this bandwagon effect isn't happening when we do homework review, right? Because maybe some of you are holding off on putting your answer in because you're seeing what other people think. It's fine to be shy, but I want to know what you think, because presumably at some point you reasoned to your answer and you had good reasons for that, or what you thought were good reasons for that. So we don't want you to just get on the bandwagon, right? Okay, we're going to move on. I think these are pretty simple, but if you need to spend some more time with them, the textbook has great examples here. So negativity bias. Maybe next time we meet, you guys can tell me if you have any examples of these cognitive biases. Okay, so this one's pretty easy to remember, right? Its name is right in here. So it's the tendency people have to weigh negative information more heavily than positive information when evaluating things. This is a more interesting one because this is not necessarily something bad. A lot of people have speculated that negativity bias is an evolved cognitive bias because it helps us evolutionarily. So again, the tendency people have to weigh negative information more heavily than positive information. What does this mean? Well, let's say, we can use the same example of oh, happens to the best of us. Right? This is kind of maybe not the best example, but we were talking about stealing earlier, so let's talk about it. You see somebody put something in their pocket, you think they must be a thief, and you conclude, I shouldn't trust him. Well, he could put anything in his pocket, right? Maybe it was just his hand. I don't know. I'm really bad at thinking of examples when I'm just staring at a computer. I apologize, you guys. But this can have a protective effect. Obviously, if you come to this conclusion, right, based on information that you've biased negatively somehow, um, it's safer because you're not trusting this person. If you were to come to a more positive conclusion or evaluate things more positively, you might end up trusting a thief, and that's risky. So I'm going to get this off of here because it's a lot easier just to tell you guys how this evolved, potentially. Everything to do with psychology and evolutionary psychology is always in flux. So don't take this as 100% absolutely true. But it's theorized that, we've all had this experience where we see something move out of the corner of our eye and we jump. And we're like, what's that? We get startled. Or maybe someone comes up behind us and taps us and we freak out. It's speculated that the reason, or theorized, that the reason we have this reaction, this kind of startle reaction, is because if in nature we saw a shadow move and it turns out it was actually just a tree blowing and we ran away, no harm done, right? We just ran away, we can come right back, we can be like, oh, that was just a tree. Everything is fine. But if we didn't have this reaction and it was not a tree, but it was a tiger, we would get eaten. So it's potentially protective. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be aware of it or keep our eye on it, right? And ask ourselves, is this affecting my rational capacity to reason through things? It just means that, I don't. Some people start feeling shame when we talk about these cognitive biases, and they want to say that they don't have them, or that they're not subject to these biases. We are all subject to these biases. The only thing you can do is be aware of them, and don't feel bad about them. Some of them evolved for very, very good reason. So let's see what our textbook has for us. I feel like it's got a little more on this subject. Negativity bias is hardwired into us. The brain displays more neural activity in response to negative information than positive information. So if you were thinking, I don't do that, well, you've got a unique brain because we can actually see this happening when we look at the brain. A corollary to negativity bias from economics is that people generally are more strongly motivated to avoid loss than to accrue gain. This bias is known as loss aversion. We're not going to put this one in our notes. It's close enough to negativity bias, and frankly, it's not going to be on the exam. So I don't want you to put it in there, but surely if any of those stories or example I gave didn't resonate with you, this one might. So operates essentially the same way. Okay, next one we're going to talk about is in-group bias. Some of you might already have an inclination what this one is as well. So what is in-group? Well, it's the group that you're in. And that can mean anything. It can mean a lot of things. So let's see. They have a really good, maybe they don't. Here we go. It should come as no surprise that we find it easier to form negative opinions of people who don't belong to our club, church, party, nationality, or other group. That's just part of in-group bias, right? And they have lots of different, sources of your group. Right? We can even extend this to humanity on whole, right? Or genders, or race, or lots of things. But let's talk about it first on a small scale, right? Maybe you really trust your fellow church members. Maybe you trust your political party members more than somebody from a different political party. Some of us will feel kind of kinship or natural trust for people who are the same nationality as we are, right? I know we hear it in the media all the time, like, we're all Americans, right? So this is an important part of in-group bias. I've heard a lot of people say, like, oh, animals don't matter when we talk about factory farming or the way animals are treated. You have extended your in-group to all of humanity, and the out-group is animals in that case. So no judgment, just trying to get this idea of what an in-group is settled. So we may perceive the members of our own group as exhibiting more variety and individuality than the members of this or that out-group, who we may view as indistinguishable from one another and as conforming to stereotypes. This one's quite lengthy. We'll get a shorter definition at the end of it, so if you don't want to write this big lengthy one down, you can just leave yourself a blank space. We may attribute the achievements of members of our own group to gumption and hard work, and our failures to bad luck, whereas we may attribute their failures, those of the members of the outgroup, to their personal shortcomings, while grudgingly discounting their achievements as mere good luck. Whew, that's a lot, but that one's quite important, right? There's a lot going on in here. So probably some of these things resonated with you. We've heard stereotypes about people from certain race groups all looking the same, right? I'm sure now that politics are the hot mess that they are, we've heard like all Republicans are the same, right? Or all Democrats are the same, right? This grouping, right? They're indistinguishable. They're all guilty of the same thing, and they all conform to the stereotype, right? Whereas our group, like our friends, our family, our members of our political party, we can detect all the nuance, variety, individuality in that group, because we're more familiar with it. But what's important to recognize is what we then do with that, right? Members of our own group, you know, they got where they got from hard work and gumption, right? Some moxie, right? Whereas if it happened to some other group in another country, maybe another nation, we would say, well, that was just good luck, right? And again, like this one's not great, and it's kind of hard to talk about. Without sounding really awful, but so I play video games, and I have definitely had guys say that my skill at it is beginner's luck, right? Rather than entertaining the concept that maybe I'm just good at this thing, right? That's an example of maybe some in-group bias with regard to gender. Again, we'll get a more solid definition of this added to our notes right at the end of the lecture. So just leave a blank space for now. So we've got this fundamental attribution error. We're not going to talk about that. We can go over it during our meeting if you guys really want to. But it's the tendency to not appreciate that others' behavior is as much constrained by events and circumstances as our own would be if we were in their position, right? Maybe somebody didn't go to college, and you're like, I just don't understand why they didn't go to college. Well, their choice regarding college might have been constrained by events. Maybe they needed to help their family out by getting a job immediately. Right? Maybe there were not any. Maybe they were just late to put in their applications, right? And we need to recognize that were our circumstances the same as theirs, we likely, you know, we'd have the same limited set of behaviors and choices that they do. So that one's a good one, but it's hard to test on, so we're not going to spend too much time with it. Okay, moving on. This one is probably my favorite. Obedience to authority. This one is very hard to mess up. So we're just going to leave ourselves a space there. What even is that? That's crazy. Oh, mercy. Okay. This one is exactly what it sounds like. So, obedience to authority has this long, fascinating history. If anyone here is a history buff, you might be aware of something called the Nuremberg defense. So, after World War II, there were the Nuremberg trials, where I say we, the world, put on trial Nazi war criminals. Uh, and there was this defense. They were just following orders. They can't be held responsible for what they did. They were just following orders. And of course, if somebody has a gun to your head and tells you to do something, then yes, you really are just like you're saving your own life. You're acting in self-preservation. I don't want to discount that as a plausible defense for one's actions. Same with like hostage situations, et cetera, et cetera. But during the Nuremberg trials, these were people who did not have guns to their head, at least for the most part. These were people who were simply obeying authority, and that was their excuse or their reason to justify their behavior. I was just following orders. So some scientists were like, is that a legitimate defense, right? Um, is just following orders a good reason for doing horrendous things? Could these Nazis have been just like you and me? Would we have done the same thing under their circumstances? So they set up a series of experiments, specifically Stanley Milgram set up a series of experiments wherein there were 3 people. There was somebody represented or pretending to be a scientist, and it may well have been a scientist, right? But what's important is that this guy had authority. He was in a lab coat, he had a clipboard, right? He seemed like an authority figure. The second person was somebody who agreed to give shocks to the third person, called the learner, right? So, and the job of the first person was to ask questions to the learner, and if the learner got the question wrong, he was meant to shock him. The shocks started out small, but then got increasingly more severe, or so the shocker was told. This is the information he was given. What he didn't know, he or she, I suppose, didn't know was that the learner was a Confederate. They were a paid actor or actress. They weren't actually being shocked. So the experiment centers on the person doing the shocking. And the reason, Milgram set it up this way is because the man in the lab coat would become insistent that the shocker or the teacher give increasingly higher voltage shocks to the learner, to the point where the learner was begging them to stop, saying, call off the experiment. And the teacher had every reason to believe that these shocks were lethal, or at least could be lethal. That's terrifying. An alarming number of standard Americans. This also was conducted, in Australia and all over Europe and whatnot. It's a very popular experiment. So an alarming number of people will continue to administer shocks, even to an unresponsive learner, somebody they might believe they have killed, just so long as that authority figure says, you have to continue shocking them. We need you to do this. Science needs you to do this. And this was a startling conclusion, and it should be a startling conclusion, because it means that plausibly the Nazis, who said they were just following orders, were indeed just like you and I. Let's tab back to our textbook. it talks a little bit about this. Psychologist Stanley Milgram discovered that a frightening percentage of ordinary men and women will administer apparently lethal electric shocks to innocent people when told to do so by an experimenter in a white coat. So just to be really clear about this, nobody was actually being shocked. They were actors or actresses. So I'm grateful the textbook says the findings are subject to multiple interpretations and explanations, but the tendency of humans to obey authority simply for the sake of doing so hardly needs experimental confirmation, right? So, I have to sneeze. I'm going to pause this. Okay, I'm back. I survived the sneeze. Just another quick note before we conclude this. I mentioned earlier that this research had been studied around the world multiple times. We actually have an example that you guys can look up if you're interested in it. French researchers created a fake TV game show that was very much like the Milgram experiments. The host instructed contestants to deliver electric shocks to an individual who was said to be just another contestant, but who in reality was an actor. The contestants complied and delivered shocks right up to the level that, if the shock was really being delivered, might execute the man. So, again, I can't stress enough how relevant these cognitive biases are and how important it is to keep our eyes on them. So while I was sneezing, I went and retrieved our definition for obedience to authority for your notes. It's just a tendency to comply with instructions from an authority. Right? Oh, no, that was exactly right. So that's all it is. It can have a shocking impact. No pun intended. Oh, that was bad. It's alarming, but it does look like, at least to some degree, we do all have this tendency to comply with instructions from an authority. Before I let you guys go, specifically in regard to obedience to authority, it's worth mentioning, actually, that as we continue to conduct these experiments, like the Milgram experiment, around the world, a lot of people in other countries do not quite respond the same way. Strangely, something like 80% of Australian women refused to shock the person. They were just like, no, that's messed up. I would do an Australian accent, but it's a very difficult accent to do. But they refused. They just outright refused. So Australian women are just very, very good, apparently. Those are the people you want to trust, even though they might not be in your in-group. They will not shock you to death. But the other thing to note is that when we change, or when researchers change the prods, when it's not a scientist, but maybe just a man in a suit or something like that, or somebody dressed up as a military authority figure, people seem less inclined to follow the instructions. So there is a chance that, at least in this horrific example, what people are responding to is an appeal to the greater good and an appeal to science. They want to be helpful, they want to be good, they want to advance science. So again, just like the textbook said, there are lots of explanations for why this might be. But maybe don't look so skeptically on your fellow man just because we've discussed this. Also, you'll see I've typed out a definition of in-group bias. Just for your notes, it's a set of cognitive biases that make us view people who belong to our group differently, better from people who don't. So we favor people from our own group. All right, last thing before we're done. If you scroll quite a ways down in your textbook, oh my goodness, so much scrolling, you will find that at the end of every chapter there is a recap. And this is the thing I said you guys would get kind of mad at me for. Quite often the recap looks a lot like our notes and what we create. So you'll see we've got claims, we've got objective claim versus subjective claim from last class, issue, question, what an argument is, right? Two parts, one of which is the premise or premises intended to provide a reason for accepting the other part, the conclusion. All of this, but the reason I showed you guys this is because we have these really wonderful, concise definitions of all these biases right here too. So if you want to take some time with these definitions as well, it's a really good idea. So these recaps are super helpful, and again, they're at the end of every chapter. So again, we won't be remembering all of these, just the ones that we have listed here in our notes. But this was a relatively straightforward class. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this. I always love getting emails and stuff about how people are already starting to apply what we've covered in class to their day-to-day life or thinking. And if you guys want to send me anything to that effect or talk about it next class, I'd be really excited with that. Okay, thank you guys. I hope everybody has a fantastic weekend. That's the wrong button. I was going to leave all elegantly. All right, have a great weekend, you guys, and I will see you next week.